Hello, I'm Alicia Harrington-Clark and welcome to our webinar this morning. I'm a policy lead at the PLSA and I'm here with our education partner, Russell Investments, and we're here to talk about governance considerations, essentially answering the question whether fiduciary management is a good option for your scheme. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers today. In fact, I think you should introduce yourselves. Would you mind, Paul, starting?
Of course, thank you, Alicia. My name is Paul Wharton. I'm a director at Russell Investments, part of the fiduciary management team, and we provide fiduciary management solutions to UK pension schemes and also pension schemes around the world. And currently we've got about 230 billion in sterling assets under management.
Thank you very much. And Peter?
Hi Alicia, my name is Peter Daniels. I head up Barnett Waddingham's FM Evaluate service. And we are one of the UK's leading independent advisors to pension scheme trustees who have put in place a fiduciary management arrangement or who are looking at putting one in place.
Thank you. So you will have your opportunity to ask your questions towards the end using the chat box. But first of all, I'd like to kick us off. So today we're going to talk through a couple of different areas. We're going to try and take them in turn, but we'll talk as we go. So we're going to talk through basically the governance processes, the regulation. We're going to start there to lay the land, and then we're going to talk through different parties and appropriate parties, and talking through who might be appropriate to take a decision on various investment strategies, and so on, and also the responsibilities of trustees, advisors and others in this space. So I think first, I guess what would be most helpful is to understand the requirements both on trustees and fiduciary managers, and particularly whether these have changed as a result of the recent CMA findings and investigation in this space.
Well, let me take that one, Alicia. And the CMA, or Competition and Markets Authority study that's been going on, feels like it's become sort of very common language across the industry. They started back in 2017, towards the end of 2017, and have gone through quite a long review process of the UK investment consulting and fiduciary management markets. This culminated in 8 remedies being published at the back end of 2018. And the ones that relate to fiduciary management are a requirement for tendering and retendering of fiduciary management mandates. There are also requirements to provide greater transparency to users and prospective users of fiduciary management on the fees that they're either being charged currently or they will be charged in such a mandate. And finally, a requirement on the industry as a collective to put in place a performance standard that gives trustees access to greater comparability, greater standardisation of performance from ourselves at Russell Investments and also our peers across the market. So these remedies, as I've outlined them in relation to fiduciary management, are aimed at giving the market or giving trustees greater visibility into the market, aimed at giving them greater comparability across fiduciary managers, and also aimed at actually aligning interests between the users and the providers of fiduciary management.
Thank you. And so does this mean that there's also equivalent or parallel requirements in the trustee space that have changed?
So at the moment, some of the requirements are on fiduciary managers, some are on the trustees who are using fiduciary management. And at the moment, the pensions regulator is going through a process of consulting on specific guidelines that will help enforce the remedies coming from the CMA. And at the moment there is consultations out on how to set objectives, on how to tender, and also guidance on how to choose the right governance framework. The process of the pensions regulator assessing the responses they've got, with the expectation that in the next couple of months there'll be final guidance. So
maybe if we talk more generally now about what fiduciary management is. So is it a product? Is it a solution? And also maybe if you could talk us through how you work with trustees to make sure that they're adopting the right approach to investing, and also the form of fiduciary management, how trustees engage with that process. Really, if you could introduce fiduciary management, I guess that would be very helpful.
Sure. So I think what the pensions regulator talks about in its draft guidance is there being a spectrum of investment governance models. I do think we get ourselves in a bit of a pickle when we talk about investment consultancy being one model and fiduciary management being another model. I think actually what we're talking about is a spectrum of different levels of delegation. So that could be delegating from one end, stock selection decisions or fund manager selection, maybe asset class selection decisions, all the way through to delegating the entire portfolio and asking your manager to outperform your scheme's liabilities by a certain amount. I think that the important point there is that level of delegation can be achieved with a fiduciary manager or without a fiduciary manager. So I think that's an important point. The question of fiduciary management then becomes one of, do we want our asset manager to also give us some advice on what we invest in, or are they just purely the implementer? But to your point of how do trustees decide which model is right for them, and I think it boils down to some key issues. Firstly, strategy. How sophisticated an investment strategy do they need to achieve their investment objectives? Secondly, control. How much do they want to control their investment decisions, or how willing are they to give those away to a specialist third party? And then thirdly, time and expertise. Even if they are really preferring to control, have they got the time and expertise to make the decisions which need to be made? I think finally cost is an important factor. So all of these things come into the mix, and I think what you find is different trustee boards are in different positions, and a different model can suit different requirements. If you've got a trustee board who need a punchy return target and maybe some good downside risk protection, but just meet maybe once or twice a year, then I think in those environments you can see maybe a fully delegated solution could be quite right. Whereas a lot of schemes have actually got a lot of their risk management in place already now, with a lot of investment in liability driven investment over the last few years. And for those schemes that are already fully hedged, you could argue that actually maybe all they want to do is delegate some of the growth assets or their entire growth portfolio. So I think it's important to understand those mix of factors for your scheme and picking a model which is right for you.
Okay, so maybe it would be helpful if you could take us through an example with a particular client or different approaches that you take with clients.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we're well placed to do that as a practitioner in the market, and of course, as Peter outlined, finding the right approach for the client situation is crucial. And typically with our clients, we operate in a full fiduciary framework where we provide the investment advice, helping set objectives, and then implement that and do what we call a total risk management approach, selecting the right asset classes and the right managers. But actually there are increasing number of pension scheme trustee groups who come to us who actually they want to retain their existing advisor. They're familiar with them. They've worked with them for a number of years in all likelihood. The advisor has knowledge and understanding of their specific circumstances, but yet they do want the benefit of fiduciary management. They want access to more sophisticated investment arrangements. They want someone who can manoeuvre slightly quicker in the market than they perhaps could under an advisory model. And they want access to benefits of scale. And a good example of a client we work with currently, they use one of the big employee benefit consultants as their investment advisor, and that consultant works with the trustees to consider their circumstance and come up with the high-level investment objectives. Those objectives are then passed to Russell Investments to go away and implement, so choosing asset classes, choosing managers within those asset classes, and thinking about other risks within the portfolio, such as currency, and managing those risks to give the best outcome. But then the trustees also employ a further party to oversee what Russell Investments is doing and the investment advisor, what they're doing from an independent perspective. So there's three parties giving their view into the mix. On the face of it from the outside looking in, that could feel slightly unwieldy, but it's worth saying, so the trustees have recently gone through a re-tender exercise and they've retained those arrangements, so they still view them as best in class and appropriate for their particular circumstance. So fiduciary management really can take a number of different formats, and it's up to the trustees, the client involved, to work out what's best to suit their circumstance.
And you mentioned there actually particular circumstances. that may or may not be appropriate or different approaches. Could you maybe talk a little bit further about what some of those circumstances might be that might impact on this decision?
Yeah, of course. And back in the, I guess, sort of the late 2000s, when fiduciary management was first becoming a solution, it was first sort of talked about as a solution, it was largely trying to help pension schemes close the funding gap. Pension schemes were underfunded and they needed a better way to generate risk-efficient investment return to close that gap. There was also focus on liability hedging, and this is one of the most complex areas that we deal with. And I think trustees found that actually delegating out this part of their asset management helped from their governance perspective. It took away a very complex consideration for them. So back in those early days, we had clients with low funding levels trying to close the funding gap in a risk-managed way. As the markets matured, fiduciary management has been used in many different ways. To give a couple of examples, firstly, it feels an increasing number of schemes are reaching a state that we refer to as self-sufficiency, where actually to be a going concern, they need a relatively low level of investment return and therefore low level of investment risk. But they're not quite at the stage where they can go to a full buyout with an insurer. And using fiduciary management to manage the assets through that stage, delivering slow, steady, pretty low risk returns is something we've seen clients increasingly interested in. For other pension schemes where actually they're at a relatively high funding level, the prime risk to them becomes, rather than thinking about the funding level day to day, it's actually how they can pay pensions next week, next month, next quarter. The actual sort of the reason why the pension scheme was set up, to pay pensions, that payment of pensions becomes the risk. So trustees are looking to generate consistent levels of income, so they have income coming out of the scheme to pay the pensioners every month or so as they go through time. So creating portfolios that deliver that income in a consistent way, bearing in mind liquidity requirements and other such things, is another area we see fiduciary management growing into. So quite a few developments over the last 10 or so years. And as I look, and I would say this, but I don't see many situations where fiduciary management couldn't play a role. Perhaps one area where perhaps you might question it is if a scheme has, let's say, 3 or 4 years to buy out, would the trustees want to go through the process of appointing a fiduciary manager with a relatively finite timescale? But in most other situations, I think fiduciary management is a really strong option that trustees should be considering.
Thank you. Peter, did you have anything that you wanted to add on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with quite a lot of what Paul has to say there. I suppose my perspective on it, though, I would almost separate two questions out. Does delegation play a role in a range of scenarios? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think everything Paul said about, from a real return generative portfolio to something which is more self-sufficient, cash flow driven investment style portfolio, I think you can make a case for delegation playing a big part as part of that. But the second question is, and does fiduciary management therefore serve a role? Because the difference between delegation and fiduciary management is the provision of advice as well. And from our experience, I think what we've seen in most cases is fiduciary management, that additional layer of advice, playing a key part when it's total portfolio delegation. If you're delegating the management of both your growth assets and your liability hedging assets, and obviously maybe some cash flow driven assets as well, there's a lot of intricacies there within the portfolio, and quite often the manager of those assets can be well placed to advise the trustees on just how to go about investing in those places. Having said that, that can be at a quite detailed level, and I would sort of echo Paul's comment from earlier that I think there's a role for an independent strategic advisor there to advise on high level strategy, to oversee the performance, and perhaps to help set the guidelines for the fiduciary manager.
So you mentioned there the role of oversight, and oversight has been growing over the past 5 years, and I just wondered whether you could maybe talk to us a little bit more about that, and particularly third-party evaluators and what value is added by that process.
Sure. So, I mean, the value comes through the independence that we are winning. We don't own any fiduciary management service or products, so we're independent, but also the knowledge and expertise in both pension scheme investing and the UK fiduciary management space. Fiduciary management is a very complex area, it's multifaceted, and if you take selecting fiduciary manager as an example, that can be a pretty time-consuming process for trustees. It can also be quite costly, both in terms of potential advisory costs, the potential transaction costs associated with turning over a portfolio and moving it all to a fiduciary manager. It's a decision you want to get right first time. And I think the real value that we can add is maximising the likelihood that trustees get it right first time. How can we do that? I think what we can do is increase the likelihood that they will find a manager who will be able to deliver the strategy, the investment strategy which a trustee wants to implement, can provide the level of flexibility which may be needed to meet the trustees' different guidelines on investments. Any preference around certain asset classes, we can help compare fiduciary manager performance and also help look at the portfolio and look at the 5-10 years ahead and say, is this a portfolio which is well positioned to deliver the returns needed to achieve the strategy? So there's that piece, but there's also the relationships that we have with fiduciary managers as a third-party advisor and the ability that trustees can leverage off those relationships, and that can help them get good quality proposals which are really tailored to their requirements. It can help ensure a smooth and efficient tendering process, and quite possibly it could also end up in better terms and a better deal for the scheme, just leveraging on off those capabilities.
If I can add to that, I mean, as I mentioned earlier about the maturing of the fiduciary management market, from our perspective at Russell Investments, and we see a number of third-party oversight groups coming and researching us, the research they're carrying out has developed nearly as quickly as fiduciary management itself. We are seeing people coming and doing operational due diligence meetings, groups coming and really trying to get under the surface of what we do from an ESG perspective. So things are much more detailed than they used to be. And there's, I think that one of the commonly quoted stats now is there's more oversight providers than fiduciary managers in the market. But like fiduciary managers, they can be bucketed into subsets, I think. So you've got the sort of the professional services companies, the big four accountants, I guess, are the predominant groups there, who as a group are doing less pension investment advice, but all seem to be focusing quite firmly on fiduciary management oversight. You've then got the employee benefits consultancies such as Barnett Waddingham, and it's the employee benefit consultants that don't have a fiduciary management offering. Most of them have sought to get into the oversight market. And then alongside those first two categories, you've got the area that I call specialists, groups such as IC Select, groups such as Muse Advisory, who are providing it from a more specialist function. Those groups were set up to provide this sort of oversight. So there are certainly groups there, and I think certainly our experience is those groups are helping trustees get a better outcome overall, and certainly understand what are the key characteristics that the fiduciary managers they're looking at have, and what would be best placed for their circumstance.
Thank you. So we've talked about the difficulties of and timeframes. Maybe we could talk about timeframes. That seems very sort of concrete. You know, how long does it take to appoint a fiduciary manager, and what might impact on that timeline?
I'll start with that one. I think that there are quite a few factors at play which can influence the time frame. How many managers do you want to receive proposals from? How many do you want to actually meet in person? Do you actually want to go and visit them at their own offices and really check out the systems? To what extent do you want to negotiate on terms? Those sorts of areas. So all of that can really impact the time frame. I'd say typically we would see pension schemes from the point of discussing objectives and setting the criteria for selecting a fiduciary manager to then choosing a preferred manager. That can take typically around about 3 months, sometimes a bit shorter, sometimes actually considerably longer, depending on what kind of trustee board and what level of due diligence they want to do. But I think that the key point is not to rush it. And it's back to that point about getting it right first time. We really encourage trustees to invest a lot of time at the outset, setting their objectives, whether that be for their investment strategy or for their investment governance framework, setting their criteria for what type of fiduciary manager might fit with them. And doing that can really make the process work much more efficiently and increase the likelihood that when you get to the point of meeting with some fiduciary managers, you actually get ones who are very well aligned with what the trustees are looking for.
Yeah, unfortunately, getting to the point of selecting preferred fiduciary manager is probably only half of the way there. Post actual decision of who you want to be your fiduciary manager, there's then two strands of work in my mind that often happen in parallel. Firstly, on the one side, you've got the investment strategy setting. So as part of a proposal, you get relatively high-level information about the pension scheme typically, but then once appointed, you go through a process of understanding more granular detail about the pension scheme, working with the scheme actuary, working with the trustees in more detail to refine that proposal and ensure that the ultimate investment objectives that the trustees agree are appropriate for their circumstance. And that's quite a body of work. Involves typically at least one trustee meeting, but often many more than that, and culminates in written investment advice from the fiduciary manager and of course the statement of investment principles being updated. And then the piece that's parallel to that is what I refer to as the practicalities. And this is actually getting the legal contractual documentation between the trustees and the fiduciary manager, and sometimes the custodian as well. Now this part can go particularly smoothly if the scheme has all the documentation lined up, but of course the know your client and the anti-money laundering documentation requirements are pretty demanding. So often going through that process can take a period of 1 to maybe even 3 months. If you're using a third-party legal representative, that adds another party into the mix. So we've, and again, it's how long's a piece of string, like Peter referred to on the pre-appointment side as well. But we've had clients go through that process in 2.5 to 3 months. But we've got another client who has taken nearly 12 months to go through it just because they've had other more important things on their agenda in their mind. So it's something that can be done pretty swiftly, but if people aren't completely aligned to the same timeframes, it can escalate if there isn't sufficient focus.
Thank you. And so we're talking a little bit now about trustee preparedness for taking decisions. There are, correct me if I'm wrong, some connection with the CMA recommendations and interventions here. Do you think that those additional layers of requirements will be beneficial, or will they add added complexity to this process?
Overall, I think, and I certainly hope they'll be beneficial. I think everyone in the industry has a view on whether the CMA study went far enough, whether it went too far. I think from my perspective, it could have gone a bit further in terms of it enforcing change, but we're yet to see how things really filter into the marketplace. As the various pieces of guidance from the pensions regulator come through, I think trustees and fiduciary managers are starting to get a better understanding of what the actual day-to-day requirements on them are. From our side as a fiduciary management provider, we need to be providing clear breakdowns of fees, which we're absolutely behind. We need to be working with our peers in terms of developing a performance standard that I referred to earlier. And then we need to be documenting this annually, our adherence to these things in compliance statements. Trustees are responsible for going through tender processes. They're responsible for also providing a compliance statement themselves on an annual basis. So there are requirements on both trustees and fiduciary managers. So as we go through the process over the next few weeks and months, there'll be greater understanding on exactly what's required. But I think overall it will be beneficial, and certainly hope that the main point here, trustees as users of this solution will get a better outcome at the end of the day.
Peter? Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Paul. I think on the whole, you've got to say this has got to be a beneficial thing for the fiduciary management industry. I think in the past, a small number of players have almost cornered the market in terms of providing services to pension schemes. While some of those services are very good, it can only be good from a competition perspective and from innovation and getting good deals for pension schemes, that there is more competition. So in that sense, it's got to be good. I do have some concerns with how it's been laid out. I think capacity in the industry could be a problem. I think over the next 18 months or so, we might expect 200, maybe even more pension schemes come into the market to retender the services, and I would have a bit of a niggle of doubt as to whether there's enough capacity within the fiduciary management space to respond to all those tenders or respond in a really good bespoke way for pension schemes. So that's one concern. My other concern will be around sort of the quality of advice which is being given to trustees who are appointing fiduciary managers or retendering their fiduciary management arrangements. And this is where I'm not sure that the regulation has gone far enough, and it seems to me that there's a bit of a disconnect in regulation that trustees must take regulated investment advice when selecting a fund manager for their pension scheme who might represent 5-10% of the scheme's assets. Yet, as it stands, there's no requirement to take regulated advice on the selection of a fiduciary manager who could, in theory, represent all of the scheme's assets, which to me seems like a riskier investment decision potentially for a trustee board. So, I mean, if I was to make a rallying cry to the FCA, it would be to consider regulating the selection decisions around appointing a fiduciary manager.
So we just talked about how maybe the new regulation will be beneficial or otherwise, might not be going far enough in some places. And so that sort of leads us naturally on to talking about how the market was working previously, and particularly in the context of increasing uncertainty and changing global and local markets. Maybe you could talk to that.
I think what's worked well over the last, say, 10, 15 years in the pension scheme investment space is innovation and the number of products and services which have come to market to allow trustees to both target decent returns but also manage risk on the downside. And I think that innovation has allowed smaller pension schemes to implement really sophisticated investment strategies. So, I mean, in that sense, absolutely, I think what we're seeing in innovation is working. And then if we talk about that in the world of sphere of fiduciary management, I think we have to say that purely in terms of performance, fiduciary managers have done pretty well over the last 5 or 10 years from what I've seen, in the sense of generally hitting client objectives. I would caveat that though with the market environment being pretty supportive for fiduciary management strategies. It hasn't been that hard to generate a decent level of return over the last 10 years. We've been in quite a bull market. And as well as that, quite fundamental to the fiduciary management approach is this idea of risk management and hedging your liability risk. And with interest rates generally on the downward trend, hedging liability risk has been a really good thing to do. I think the challenge for fiduciary managers is lower market returns. Can fiduciary managers adapt to that different market environment?
From the sort of the perspective of a practitioner in the market, we're certainly seeing fiduciary management work for our clients. Our historic performance track record is that across our full fiduciary management client base, we've outperformed by 0.6% per annum. Now, one might say, well, that doesn't feel like a huge amount, but our very definite view is actually if we outperformed by 1, 2, 3, 4%, we'd be taking excessive risk, and we wouldn't need to take that much risk. So we're certainly very pleased that track record of 0.6% per annum demonstrates we're taking the right balance between the amount of risk we're seeking to take in order to generate that return. Investment outcome is clearly important, but another point that we place a lot of value in is what clients think of in terms of the way we work with them. Are they understanding how we're talking to them? Are we there delivering things to them proactively? And the best way that we find to get an understanding of this is through surveying our client base that we do every year or two, and certainly the feedback is positive. There are constructive bits that we've worked on with clients, such as improving reporting, being clearer on what we're doing from an ESG perspective. But the overriding theme is that clients like working with the team at Russell Investments. and are certainly feeling they're getting a better outcome, both investment results and qualitatively, than they were previously.
Thank you very much, Paul from Russell Investments, Peter from Barnett Waddingham. We'd now like to take your questions from the chat box.